What's up everybody, Jeff here, and this series is all about solo play games, but Vagrantsong is a 2 to 4 player game. But I thought it'd be worth giving it a try anyway. Now, I have a video up on the channel where I interview the designer of Vagrantsong about the recent Kickstarter and some of the new stuff that's coming to the game in the future. So you should definitely go check that out. But this video is going to be primarily about the base game of Vagrantsong and my experiences playing through it solo. So there's a lot of really interesting design that went into Vagrantsong, but as is usually the case with games like this, I have a hard time getting together a group that wants to play it all together. I have multiple gaming groups, but they tend to be very specific to certain games or certain types of games, and it's kind of hard to get them to move out of their bubble and get into something else. Vagrantsong, if you're not familiar, is a 2 to 4 player boss battling game. And it's got a really interesting story style and a really interesting aesthetic and art style as well. The game plays out through different scenarios over the course of a campaign, and depending on how you do and some of the decisions that you make, there can be a little bit of variety in the encounters that you see. Each scenario has a little narrative introduction that explains what you're doing on this haunted train and what's going on when you encounter the enemies, which are called haints. And then you jump right into the action. Now, one of the most interesting questions for me is always how a game balances and accounts for different numbers of players that might be playing the game. In my experience, there's a couple of different ways that can be done. One of them is to have the players control the same number of characters no matter how many people are sitting at the table. So if it's a 4-player game, there's going to be 4 player characters no matter if there's 1 of you or 4 of you. The second would be to scale the encounters in the game depending on the number of players, so you might have more enemies or the enemies might have more health depending on how many people are playing. And the third is to have the enemy players get a turn for every player character's turn. Meaning that for every additional player that's in the game, the enemies are actually going to get another turn to respond to what you're doing. And Vagrantsong is interesting because it actually sort of combines elements of both of the last two. So every round, every Vagrant is going to get one opportunity to activate and take their turn. And every time you activate a Vagrant, at the end of that activation, the Haint or the enemy is going to get a turn. You're going to repeat this process until all the Vagrants have gone, and then the round ends and you start a new one. But in addition to that, most of the scenarios have some variable that's going to scale depending on the number of players that are in the game. So for example, a lot of times what you'll see is that the breakpoint of the particular haint that you're fighting is going to be higher if you have more players in the game, which basically equates to them having more health. Now, I think there's pros and cons to the different ways that games can handle adjusting for the player count. And the way that Vagrantsong does it is nice because it's pretty simple. You just get in the sort of habit of activating a model and then having the haints activate, and then activating a model and then having the haints activate. And it's pretty seamless in that sense. It's also nice because with the exception of solo play, you can adjust the number of Vagrants so that everybody is just controlling one character, and you don't have to worry about somebody having to juggle multiple. The exception there being that if you're playing solo, there is a minimum of 2 Vagrants, so you will have to play at least 2 characters. Now, the downside to this system, I think, is that you can run into situations where you activate a character and then they end up in a bad situation where they're vulnerable or the enemies are really going to pick on them. And because the enemies get a turn every time your friendly characters get a turn, that character can get stuck there for multiple activations where the Haints can really get a chance to beat up on them. And in some cases, there may not be much you can do about it. This was famously a big problem when the Dark Souls board game came out years back because you could activate one character and then all the enemies would just gang up on them and kill them in 2 or 3 activations, and there would be nothing you could do about it. So there's really a risk that you're going to get severely punished by sort of mispositioning your character before you have an opportunity to activate that character again and move them out of the way. But you kind of get used to the flow of the game in that sense, and you learn to avoid putting yourselves in positions like that. One of the things that mitigates that about Vagrantsong is that just like the Haints, your player characters are going to have multiple health bars based on the number of upgrades that they have equipped. And because of that, it's very unlikely that a Haint is going to catch you off guard and then suddenly kill you out of nowhere without you really seeing it coming. They really have to grind through a lot of your health and go through multiple health bars in order to actually kill you or make you go westbound. And because of that, you'll usually have some ability to react to the things that they're doing. So even if you end up in a vulnerable position, there's usually going to be some ability to either move that character, heal them, or activate them before they've lost all of their abilities and eventually die. On top of that, there are some abilities in the game that allow you to distract the Haint, or you can try to pull aggro from them to take the heat off of that vulnerable character. Now, the gameplay in Vagrantsong is actually pretty simple and straightforward, at least at the start. You have a few different stats, like a movement speed, a bust value, and a patch-up value. And at the beginning of your activation, your character will have 3 coins that they can use to place on different actions to perform them throughout their turn. If you want to do something like the bust action, which is effectively an attack, you get to roll a bone or a die for each coin that you have on the attack. And then for each of those dice that meets or exceeds the bust value, the attack has been successful. And just an interesting note, this means that you're actually giving humanity to the Haint, because in this game, we're trying to save the ghosts, we're not trying to kill them. Again. Now, a lot of the complexity of the game comes from extra skills and junk, which is like equipment that you get to equip on your characters. The skills can be a variety of things, including stronger attacks, ranged attacks, abilities that heal your characters, or support abilities that can do things like move other characters around, and a whole variety of other things. But really, where I think the bulk of the complexity of the game comes in is the design of the scenarios. Every scenario in the game has a very unique feel to it, and this comes from things like the way the Haints behave, the different environmental effects that can happen, as well as contextual interactions that you have with certain areas of the board, like if you go to a certain marker and perform a search on it. This can be things like finding unique items, triggering traps, it can cause new enemies to appear or even allies, unlock permanent abilities or items, change the layout of the board, or give you all sorts of bonuses or debuffs. It's actually kind of shocking how much variety the designers were able to put into a relatively simple game. And it's to the point where some of the scenarios actually feel more like you're playing through a puzzle than a boss fight. Now, all this stuff is really cool, but I tell you that to tell you this. There's a couple of things that you want to keep an eye out for if you're going to try to play this game solo. Because again, it's not really designed with solo play in mind. You're going to have to play at least 2 Vagrants when you run through the game, and because of that, there's going to be a lot of things for you to try to remember and things for you to manage as you go throughout the campaign. It's not a ton of stuff. There's certainly games that have more complexity to them in this sense, but each Vagrant is going to have up to 4 abilities and 1 piece of junk, and by later in the game, you're going to have a whole bunch of them available to choose from, so making those selections is something that you're going to have to think about for multiple characters. I think for 2 or 3 Vagrants, it's not too much to juggle, but I might recommend staying away from playing a 4-player game. The game balance seems to be a little bit more difficult when you play with 4 Vagrants, and if you add to that the increased complexity of playing those 4 Vagrants by yourself, it can be a little bit much to handle. But I kind of like giving myself a tough time, so that's exactly how I played it, and it went reasonably well. So if you're up for the challenge, then go for it. Now, the only real problem that I had when playing the game solo was keeping track of things that can only be done once per round. So, for example, there are rummage tokens that you can acquire throughout the course of a scenario, and each character can only use a rummage item once per turn. Now, if you were just playing one character, it would be relatively easy to remember if you would use an item on this turn or not. But because some of those items get used when it's not your turn, for example, you use some of them defensively when you get attacked, if you're juggling multiple characters, it's very easy to forget which characters have actually used items and which haven't. Now, there's a simple enough solution for this. What I got in the habit of doing is just putting an extra unused Haint standee on the card for the characters once they've used a rummage item in the turn. And then at the end of the turn, I just take them off the character board when I refresh everything else to switch over to the next turn. I'm sure there's even easier ways to keep track of things like this, and you'll probably come up with something on your own, but it's something that you definitely want to be aware of because it's very easy to screw up. The only other real issue I had in playing the game solo was something that I ran into in some of the later scenarios. There were a couple of scenarios that had so many different moving parts and so many contextual conditions and debuffs and things to keep track of, and a lot of those were things that only applied to certain Vagrants, and some of them were things that applied across the board, that it became extremely difficult to keep track of all of them, and I found that I was often forgetting about certain things that I could or couldn't do, and unfortunately there was not really an easy way to fix it. I think it only really became an issue in maybe 2 scenarios, and unfortunately I think because the game was designed to be played with multiple people, if you had multiple people sitting at the table, it would be a lot easier for everyone to keep track of their own conditions, and for you to kind of work together as a group to remember the sort of overall conditions that were affecting everybody. But as a solo player, it was pretty tough to keep up with all that. Now, nothing in the rules of Vagrantsong requires that a different human control each character that's in the game, but there was one element of the game that I thought probably would have been better if there was a different human controlling every Vagrant. In between scenarios, you do something called Witness the In-Between, and this is a little narrative event that happens in between the action that happens between the train cars. It was really one of my favorite parts of the game just for the thematic and sort of role-playing element of it, and often what it involves is each of the characters has to make a decision without knowing what the outcome of that decision is going to be. Usually it was something pretty abstract, like asking you how you feel about something or how you react to hearing a particular noise. And then you'd have a bunch of choices and you could pick one and there would be a positive or a negative result depending on what you chose. Now, when you're one person making that choice for multiple different Vagrants, I think it's a little bit less immersive because it's a little bit harder to get yourself in the headspace of the different characters, and it tended to be kind of tempting for me to just make the same choice for everyone. Or I would go the opposite direction and think, well, I got to try to spread the decisions out so I can see all the different outcomes. And I think this would be a little bit more of an enjoyable process if you were just making that decision for your own character so that everybody could have their own unique thought process behind it, and then the outcomes might feel a little bit more justified. Again, it was something that I really enjoyed, and I thought it was a really cool element of the game, but I think it might have been something that lost a little bit of its luster when I was playing it solo. Overall, I really enjoyed Vagrantsong, and I think it can be played solo pretty easily without much hassle at all. It's definitely not the ideal way to play, so if you can get a group together, that's probably your best bet. But with a little bit of extra effort and keeping track of a few things, it can definitely work, so if you don't have a group, don't let that scare you away from playing. After I finished my 4-player campaign, I actually went back and played through a couple of scenarios with 2 characters, and I think I've come to the conclusion that 3 is probably the right balance, but that's definitely something that's pretty subjective, so you'll have to kind of give it a try for yourself and see what you like. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, definitely make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Definitely get down in the comment section and let me know what you thought, and let me know if you have any recommendations for solo games that I should check out. There's also some important links in the description, including a link to my Discord if you want to come hang out and chat with me and the rest of the community. I also have a weird affiliate link, so if you want to pick up a copy of Vagrantsong, then you can make a purchase through that link and it actually supports the channel. Or if you want to support the channel directly, then you can check out the link for the Patreon, where you can get a whole bunch of different benefits, and I would appreciate it very much. And with that, I want to thank the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Devin, and Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.